Well, good morning. My name is Dawn Marie Rubio, and I'm the State Court Administrator.
My name is Stephen Brown. I'm a Superior Court Judge for Grace Harbor County and Chair of the Superior Court Judges Association Therapeutic Courts Committee.
And I'm Scott Ahlf. I'm the Olympia Municipal Court Judge.
So thank you for the opportunity to acquaint you with therapeutic courts generally and specifically here in Washington. Here's what Judge Brown, Judge Ahlf, and I will cover today. How these courts operate, what constitutes a therapeutic court, what research and data say about best practices, and what emerging trends and efficacy looks like. Washington state courts are non-unified. You may have also heard the term decentralized. However, Washington tracks a traditional court structure of trial courts and appellate courts or reviewing courts. Therapeutic courts operate within the trial court level where judges have jurisdiction over civil and criminal cases and child welfare matters. So just as the legislature uses hearings, debates, and votes, a court generally organizes its day-to-day operations by dockets and calendars. So in that vein, a therapeutic court is a docket or a calendar that the local trial court establishes to serve a specific purpose or a specialized need.
So therapeutic courts can serve various populations that impact our civil and criminal justice system. So the terminology can be confusing. You've probably heard a lot of different labels over time. Drug court, treatment court, recovery court, problem-solving court, collaborative court, community court. So certain factors do define a therapeutic court. Therapeutic courts have multidisciplinary teams involving the justice system, treatment and other service providers, and recovery support providers. They use collaboration and information sharing. We focus on swift entry into treatment and other services. We use behavior modification through incentives and sanctions. We focus on staff training, so we stay up to date on the latest research on how to do our jobs and make sure we do our role in the therapeutic court correctly. And we engage in self-evaluation and also feedback from who we're providing and all of our participants, so we can also improve our performance. And also, in defining a therapeutic court, it's something that's continues. It's sustained through the system, through our system. So, just because somebody says they're a drug court doesn't make it so. All right.
Representative Clifford, do you have a question?
All right.
Yes, if I may, Madam Chair. You talked about evaluation or assessing how we're doing and talking about participants, et cetera. Some of the people who are involved in therapeutic courts have committed a crime against someone else in the state. Do we go to the victims of some of these crimes and say, what do you think about how's it going and how they feel about the process?
The victims are involved in most of these. Most therapeutic courts don't deal a lot with violent crimes, and so they're mostly property, burglary, theft. So, and then we'll also have restitution limits. As far as if there's so much restitution, because one of the requirements of completing a therapeutic court is you pay your restitution before you're out.
Excellent.
All right. So so we limit on how much that's going to be. Otherwise, it becomes impractical. So and we have to have consultation with the victims who are owed the restitution, so they understand what's happening in the justice system.
And a lot of times with therapeutic courts, like a community court, is dealing with more than just the individual that's involved. It's dealing with the community, and so the community courts are created to address needs in the community. And so a lot of times what we'll do in a community court is they will write a letter of insight on what occurred, why their crime occurred, what happened with them. And sometimes that will be a letter that will be written to the victim of their crime. And so we do a lot of that type of thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
So now the who, what, where, and when and where of therapeutic courts. The who, the people that are involved in therapeutic courts are those that are dealing with drug addiction, with mental illness, with they're undereducated, a lot of times homeless, a lot of things that, and as Judge Brown said, multidisciplinary approach to those individuals. And so when they come to the therapeutic court, we're going to address the whole, the individual. And so what we do, the what, is addressing it's a more intensive approach. It's an individualized approach. Now, I've been on the bench for 15 years, and I've seen a lot of numbers come through. With the therapeutic courts, we see individuals, and so it's the when, it's the what, it's how you're addressing those individuals. We have a number of providers that are involved. We have chemical dependency providers, we have mental health providers, we have homeless advocates. We do a lot of different things in the what, and trying to have that wraparound to address those needs. The therapeutic courts are typically a specialized calendar or day of the week that they're addressing. They're separated from the traditional court setting, and so those individuals are addressed separately so we can address the needs that they have. And the where is somewhat interesting. There's a where in the traditional drug court is done in the courtroom setting. A DUI court is typically done in a DUI setting, or in the courtroom setting, I should say. But when we're dealing with some of our community courts and mental health courts, they're going to be out in the community. Spokane Municipal Court, King County District Court have their hearings are done in their local library. And some of our libraries are underutilized now with as much of the data that we are, the electronic data that we use. So, but our libraries are now being used as a community resource, and so they're using those there. With my court, we made a prior executive conference room into a second courtroom, and so we have the individuals are on the same level as the judge. Instead of the judge up above talking down to them, it's on the same level, and it's a more therapeutic approach to it.
So currently there are 108 therapeutic courts operating in our superior, district, and municipal court levels. And this is a dynamic number because several are in planning stages at present. And this slide also shows the distribution of the courts as well as the types of court across the state. Each of these courts is attempting to address the underlying factors that bring people to the attention of the court, whether this is substance abuse, mental health issues, co-occurring disorders, homelessness, or any combination of these issues.
Superior Court Judge Ed Murphy remembers that day in July of 2014 that Eric came into his courtroom.
That day, July 18th, when we took you into custody, I took you into custody, you were broken.
It was on that day that Eric was given a second chance.
The Family Drug Court program saved my life.
The Pierce County Family Dependency Drug Court is a voluntary program that's offered to parents with substance abuse issues who have had their children removed from their care. Participants go through a rigorous drug treatment program, get counseling, parent and life skills classes, and progress is monitored by the court. The goal is to reunite children with their families.
Therapeutic courts originated first in Miami, Florida, about 30 years ago. In an effort to combat the cycle of drug-related offenders that judges were seeing over and over again, the Miami-Dade County courts were looking for a way of doing business differently, addressing the underlying criminogenic factor of substance use and becoming agents of change. And not too much later, the first therapeutic courts began operations in Washington, first in our larger urban centers and then moving into smaller urban and more rural areas. And as mentioned earlier, the types of therapeutic courts have expanded in Washington as well.
So I know on the chart there we have 2014 as the last date, but in the last 5 to 10 years, there's really been an influx of community courts and that type of thing around the country. Started in New York in the late 1990s, in the early 2000s, and then have moved on into the other jurisdictions. In the state of Washington, we now have 9 current community courts, and currently operating. There's another 9 or 10 that are going to be operating probably in the next year and a half or so. We have courts in Spokane and Olympia, draw up Federal Way. King County has 3 in their district court, and Aberdeen has 1 as well.
Starting first very much as grassroots efforts in the late 80s and 90s, the number of therapeutic courts has spread across the nation and support has also grown nationally. For example, 2 national court leadership associations, the Conference of Chief Justices and the Conference of State Court Administrators, have passed several resolutions endorsing problem-solving courts as their reference, their associated principles and methods, and calling for their expansion. And these resolutions are located in the list of reading materials that are at the end of this slide deck.
Okay, so we talked about what is a therapeutic court earlier, kind of gave you some of the categories and how you can determine if it's a therapeutic court. Best practice standards talk about the how. How do we implement the model for the most effective outcomes based on existing research? So in doing that, what are the issues that the therapeutic court seeks to address and for whom? And then we go on to, and also, how should the therapeutic court organize itself and its programs to achieve the desired outcomes? So for example, in an adult felony drug court, you're looking at reduction of criminal recidivism and the associated cost to the justice system, the larger community, and society. Okay, so we'll go to best practice standards. The National Association of Drug Court Professionals adopted best practice standards based on the research and study, 2013, 2015, and revised their texts in 2018. So first, it talks about your target population. You know, what's the eligibility requirements, what are exclusion criteria for drug courts. So candidates are evaluated for admission. We use an evidence-based screening or assessment tools to help pick those who are appropriate for the programs. Again, for example, in adult felony drug court, we focus on what's called high risk, high need recidivist criminal offenders with a substance use disorder. We talk about equity and inclusion, so we want to make sure that we don't have our court use inequitable practices and come up with disparate outcomes, that we're only dealing with certain portions of our population because they may have more advantages. We talk about the roles and responsibilities of the judge. So basically the judge has to stay informed, stay trained on the latest practices, participate in team meetings, and again, as well as maintaining your proper judicial role. And we move on to incentive sanctions and therapeutic adjustments. So there are consequences for behavior. We deal with behavior modification. So we try to make that predictable, fair, and consistent, and we administer that in accordance with evidence-based principles for behavior modification. So jail becomes more like the last resort, and then what studies have found actually is jail is often counterproductive to behavior modification, which might seem counterintuitive to a criminal justice system that's based on punishment primarily. But that's what the studies show. They show that incentives are more effective in changing people's behavior than sanctions or punishments. But we do hold the offenders accountable for the rule violations. It's important to help them proceed. We talk about best practices in having complementary treatment and social services, case manager, mental health treatment. A lot of substance use disorder individuals have co-occurring disorders. Housing assistance is a big deal. You need sober housing for people and coming off the streets, and that's right now in our program locally, and I know a lot of programs around the state, it's very difficult. You get to a place, there's no place. We got people that are eligible. We can't bring them in because they have no place to live. So.
Rep.
All right.
Clifford, could you hold your question until the end of the panel, please? Thank you.
All right. So drug and alcohol testing. So in In a therapeutic court, if we're dealing with substance and alcohol or alcohol abuse, we have frequent random and comprehensive testing to ensure abstinence and measure progress. That's another issue that's coming to the fore now. There's some changes in standards about how that's going to be paid for, so it becomes a big expense. Therapeutic court, we test it randomly at least twice a week. That's the best practice standard. The medical necessity for somebody just in a treatment program is once a month, or is twice a month. And let's say in a child welfare case where the parents have a substance use disorder and the children are removed, they are tested once a month. So random, but once a month. And finally, on best practices for 8, 9, and 10 here, there's 10 of them. It focuses on your multiple disciplinary team. We have staffing sessions before each calendar with members of the team. So we talk about our participants and go over their progress in the program. So that is a big deal on how to run a therapeutic court. Caseload management. Again, we have to, the size of a court is based on the local need, our resources, and our ability to apply best practices. And finally, best practices include monitoring and evaluation. I know in my court, we had a group come in after we started our first program after 6 months to evaluate what we were doing and were we following best practices. And again, that's really the only way you can do this and ensure good outcomes. All right, so there are, you heard me talk about high risk, high need. Those are the people that spend a lot of money in the criminal justice system, and so we're going to spend a lot of money and resources. That's what adult felony drug courts do. That's why you saw the statistic, there's about 26 now, and that's spreading to rural areas. San Juan County started an adult felony drug court earlier this year. We started our program in April of last year. So we're now being able to extend that out because the resources we're finding the resources to make it happen, and because of the good outcomes that it gets. So when you're talking about tracks and how we can expand, we look at who we're dealing with. And we use the quadrant model is the easiest way to look at it. There's no statistic on, that's a quadrant model, one form of it. You're talking about high risk, high need adult drug courts. And then a lot of places now are going to some other identifying offenders, what are called low risk, high need. A lot of times first time drug offenders with a substance use disorder, maybe not so chronic, that they're the multiple offenders, maybe first-time drug offenders. So you're using that. You can establish another track in your adult felony drug court to deal with those offenders. You don't want to. Studies have shown you don't want to mix these populations in your treatment groups, in your drug court. It's a whole separate process. If you take your low-risk people, the people that aren't likely to reoffend, compared to the high-risk people, you don't want that group in there learning from our more people with a longer history. So that gives you some idea on how we do that. Our prosecutor ran a diversion program for a long time, so we're looking, which was dealing with the low-risk, high-need people, first-time offenders. They just graduated last week, and so, but we're going to incorporate that now into our program at the first of the year. All right, so that's kind of gives you some idea how we look at who we deal with.
So in the courts of limited jurisdiction, the district and municipal courts, the trend now is going towards community courts. There are a number in the state. There's 9 currently in the state. There's another 9 or 10 that are about to come online in the next year or so. Community courts take an approach that we have the low risk, high needs offenders. We also have some high risk, high needs offenders as well. Sometimes I say we have felons in between felonies is what we're dealing with. So it's, but we don't just address the the low risk folks. We have a lot of different people that are involved. So with the community courts, we do have that, as I indicated before, the wraparound. We have, with my court, we have 15 different providers that are there every week. We deal with mental health issues. We deal with chemical dependency issue, homelessness, education. We're in Olympia. We have intercity transit. We work on, so some of the things that we're trying to get them to do is to change behaviors. And so when we do that, we have to figure out what's going on with them. When they start in our court, I say, we want to figure out what got you here. We don't care what the crime was. We want to figure out what in your life got you to where you're at right now and what we can do to get you to where you want to be. And so that's the changes that we're trying to make. Washington continues to be a leader in that. Olympia and Spokane are both mentor courts for community courts nationwide. We're 2 of the 4 in the nation that are mentor courts. I believe now they're up to 150 community courts in the nation. And so we continue to work with them. We use alternatives to incarceration. We use a lot of work crew, community service. Almost everybody that comes involved with our courts will give back to the community in some way. And so with either that work crew or that community service, we're keeping them out of the jail. We're reducing the jail costs. We're also, they're going to get the other needs met that they have. A lot of times sanctions are different. A lot of times one of our sanctions will be write a letter of insight, and that letter of insight can be on any topic that they're dealing with. I've had write a letter of insight on why it's important to be on time. I've had write a letter of insight on why it's important to go to a meeting, or I've had one individual write a letter to his mom what kind of impact he's had on her with his use. And so it's just a number of different things. Everything we do is evidence-based, and so we continue to do so. And we'll talk about that more.
Therapeutic courts are likely the most heavily researched aspect of the court system to date. Each year, there are meta-analysis of research and data to identify and hone in on what is working for therapeutic courts. From there, promising and best practices are identified and refined over time. So, for example, there are data that indicate the amount of time that a judge should spend engaging with a drug court participant to realize the best outcomes. So what is appropriate in one type of therapeutic court, however, is not always appropriate in another type. You heard earlier about what works best in an adult drug court, but these principles do not always translate to mental health courts or other problem-solving courts. Even as recently as last week, new best practice standards were established for family treatment courts, which have some similarities, but also some significant differences to adult drug court. To fully realize the potential of therapeutic courts statewide in our non-unified court system will take some centralized resourcing, and that is where the Administrative Office of the Courts comes in. Our vision is that we would have dedicated AOC staff to support the work of the therapeutic courts by identifying the goals and performance measures, facilitating training for team members, ensuring courts use evidence-based practices, mentoring, monitoring compliance and outcomes, replicating success from other jurisdictions, and improving programs over time. And unfortunately, we were not successful during this last legislative session for funding, in funding our decision package to have the dedicated AOC staff to support the work of the therapeutic courts across the state, as well as the impact of behavioral health in the state court system. So we've been unable to make this vision a reality. So that's where your assistance would be so valuable to this effort.
Do therapeutic courts work? The answer is yes. And the question is how they work. To me, as an individual judge, it's to see the change in the individual in front of me. And so I understand that's not the data that's going to show you what you need to see, but I see a change in the life of somebody that's in front of me. I see somebody that hasn't had a job in 15 years. Now they're working. They have a house. I had an individual that I used to be a prosecutor that I prosecuted 25 years ago, come through our community court, got a license for the first time in 20 years. So it's those type of things, the individual approaches that we see. But I know we need data, and so we take a lot of data. We do a lot of data, and we get a lot of information. With our community court, we've been up and running for about 3.5 years now. And so we've seen that our recidivism rate for our graduates is 17%. That's lower than our rest of our folks is 40%. So we're seeing those numbers. We're seeing the changes, and those are the things that the empirical data I know that we need to have. If we go to the next slide. King County District Court is really innovative in a lot of their programs. They have 3 community courts. They also have a mental health court that they've created with, and they use throughout the county. It's not just in their court, but they use other jurisdictions can have individuals go through their mental health court. They've have data here. As you can see that their recidivism rate is 28% for their participants compared to 38% in the regular force. They have fewer days of incarceration, 48 to 67, lower rate of psychiatric hospitalization, and then fewer outpatient emergency department visits. So we all get numbers. We all provide those numbers. As I say again, what I'm looking for is the individual, but I know we need to provide the numbers elsewhere.
So the other place to find those numbers, if you haven't already, is the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. They do a lot of, they examine the research and do their own researching to look at our benefit and cost ratios for therapeutic courts. So data from 2017 show a benefit to cost ratio of $2.92 or a net benefit of $9,145 per participant in adult drug courts. And they also shows a benefit to cost ratio of $5.55 or a net benefit of $14,373 per participant in adult mental health courts.
Thank you. For the interest of time, this is the part where it's no fun being chair. I really want to know more, but because of interest of time, I would ask the member to finish reading up and looking at all the data that followed and this awesome video. We do have 2 members with questions, and so I'd like to reserve the rest of the time for questions from members. Representative Shea.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a very quick question. I saw there were only 10 veteran courts and 2 only in Superior Court. Is there some kind of a barrier or something to those courts maybe being more prolific, or is it just a matter of resources at this point?
I think a lot of those, there's specific veteran courts, but a lot of the community courts and the mental health courts incorporate veterans in those programs, and so it's not necessarily separate. I mean, because some of the jurisdictions are not going to have enough veterans in order to just have a full veterans court program. And I know some do, and I know it's very important that they do work with that.
Could you provide us with the statistics of the number of veterans that are going through kind of all of the therapeutic courts? That would be very helpful.
We'll have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. Representative Clifford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can we throw out slide 13 real quick? Is that possible?
I'm doing my best.
You're
Okay.
there. Equity and inclusion. Are you telling me truly that through this court system, we're trying to be fair and equitable and give equal justice to all?
That's
Because I
what we
keep
try.
hearing otherwise all the time.
That's what we try to do, and we track who we deal with. Each therapeutic court tracks your participants, including including by everything: your race, gender, disability, socioeconomic status. We're tracking all those things, and we're making sure that so we can see what we're doing, who we're dealing with, and then what's happening. Are we having a disparate impact? Is this only being offered to certain people and not others? So that's what each therapeutic court is required to do.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and please kindly stay a little longer afterward.
Okay,
Thank you.